Thank you for watching the Housing Oregon YouTube channel. Please like and subscribe. Slide decks from the presenters are going to be available below. Thanks for watching.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kim Crepane with Holst Architecture, and if you're here for Carbon Crossroads, you're in the right place. Holst is a mid-size architecture firm headquartered in Portland. We have about 51, 52 people with a small office also in Minneapolis. We are a certified WBE, DBE, Just Corporation, and B Corp. So super happy to be here today. I want to introduce Hannah Resnick and Ben Ott. They're going to be talking to you today about their study that we, I guess, was completed and funded by Energy Trust of Oregon, or they were the grant maker, and so they're going to talk a little bit about that. Hannah is a multidisciplinary designer who creates spaces that are sustainable and supportive of human health and well-being. She's a licensed architect and interior designer. At Holst, Hannah seeks out unique solutions for each design challenge, guided by her background in architecture, interior design, and sustainability research. Most recently, Hannah completed the renovation of the Street Roots office over on West Burnside, and they are a nonprofit organization that publishes a weekly social justice newspaper, and it's sold by people experiencing houselessness. Hannah is currently a key member of the team for the East County Library Project out in Gresham, Oregon, helping to deliver a new 95,000 square foot flagship library. Ben Ott. Ben joined Holst in 2012 after living in Chicago, Paris, St. Louis, Buenos Aires, and Los Angeles. He brings a great diverse experience to Holst, having worked on domestic and international projects, including museums, residences, and educational facilities. Ben is also our dedicated building information modeling coordinator, and Ben oversees all BIM operations at Holst. Currently, Ben is working on the Rand Road project in Hood River for community development partners, and I think they're ready to get started. Thank you.
Thanks, Kim. All right. Hi, I'm Hannah, and I will be sharing the research that Ben and I worked on last year, funded by Energy Trust of Oregon, their research fellowship. Oh, looks like the page down doesn't work completely. Okay, sorry, just figuring out the controls on this. So the overview of our research, the Energy Trust of Oregon project looked at the operational, embodied, and whole life carbon of 8 multifamily buildings in the Pacific Northwest. And you can see those 8 projects on the screen are the ones that we looked at. We had 2 primary research goals. One was to provide public, operational, and embodied carbon data, especially for low and mid-rise wood frame multifamily construction in Oregon. And we also wanted to determine the lifespan balance between operational and embodied carbon for those same projects. So we wanted to see, is with the current state of building code and efficiency of the grid, is operational carbon still more than embodied carbon, or where are we at on that scale? So I want to just take a moment to acknowledge the building owners who agreed to let us study their buildings and also shared with us the energy usage data for the project. So these building owners were Roundhouse, Our Just Future, Transition Projects, Home Forward, and Reach CDC. Here are some images of a few of the projects that we will be looking at today. Before we get started, how many people are familiar with operational and embodied and whole life carbon? You could just raise your hand if you're familiar with all those terms. Okay, so it's kind of a good kind of half and half. So when we say operational carbon, we're referring to the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the energy usage when a building is in operation. So this includes direct emissions as well as indirect emissions such as transmission loss during electricity transmission. This could also include carbon offsets, but that is really a nuanced and kind of controversial topic that we aren't going to get into today. When we say embodied carbon, we are referring to the emissions associated with the production of the materials that go into the building, so the structure, the finishes, also when they are being constructed into the building, repair and replacement down the road, and finally when they are demolished and sent to a landfill or recycled at the end of life. And this may also include carbon offsets in the future. And so when we bring those together, we're really trying to figure out, the whole impact of the building would be considered the whole life carbon. So this would include both operational and embodied carbon. So I'm sure all of you have seen a slide similar to this in the past, but just again, to put this in perspective in global CO2 emissions, we're looking at about 37% being from buildings, about 28% of those of the global CO2 emissions are operational energy usage in buildings. And about 9% are currently due to embodied carbon from buildings. And we also have an additional 6% of infrastructure, some of which is indirectly attributable to buildings. And again, why does this matter? Well, we are, on track to, blow past even the 2.1 degree temperature rise. We have stated policies and announced pledges, and we all know how we're not meeting the targets that we are setting. But if there's one last chance to basically limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we basically need to achieve net zero by 2050. And this is from the International Energy Agency. And with that, we'll go into an intro to the projects we looked at, and I'll have Ben come up here.
So we looked at 8 projects across Oregon and Idaho, 5 in the Portland area, 3 in the Idaho area. The green zone is zone 5B climate, and the yellow is zone 4C. We would have loved to have studied some Eastern Oregon projects. Fortunately, we didn't have any multifamily projects at the time to go into, but the Boise projects are a pretty close proxy. Then this graph is kind of showing some key climate information, comparing those different climates. So on the average high and low temperature, Portland is the green lines there. It's kind of in the middle, pretty temperate. And then when you go to more the Boise, Medford, you get hotter in the summers, drops to similar lows in the summers, and not quite as cold. And then Bend gets a little bit colder in the summer, and their lows kind of hit the same time. And then over at the percent of clear skies, that's a kind of an important metric for solar. The more clear skies you get, the more power you can have. So Portland's a little bit cloudier than the rest of them. Then these first 4 projects are all wood frame over concrete podiums, so that ranging between 3 stories of wood frame over 1 story of concrete podium, all the way up to 5 stories over 3 stories of concrete podium. The 72 Foster projects, 101 units, has a little bit of retail on the ground floor and parking in that podium, and also has solar panels. Nick Fish is a affordable and market rate project with some office, retail, and parking in the ground floor or in the podium. Also has solar panels. The Hearth project and Fowler are 2 very similar projects, 163 units over the top of retail and parking down in that podium. Then the next 4 buildings that we looked at are all wood frame construction, no concrete podium. The Argyle Garden project is affordable permanent supportive housing. Half of those units were studios, and about half of them were single residency occupancy units, which is a type of housing that has multiple unrelated individuals who each have their own bedroom that share a kitchen and a couple of baths. So really dense configuration. 3,000 Powell's, another affordable project, 196 units. It's using the new energy code. The Aurora is another affordable project. This one is all electric and also uses solar panels. And then the Clara project out in Idaho is several walk-up units, so a little bit different typology than some of the other ones that we were looking at. This is just another look at all those projects again, like starting on the left with 2- and 3-story wood frame buildings going all the way up to the right where we've got 5-story wood frame over the top of 3 stories of concrete. In the middle, the Aurora and 3,000 Powell had some mixed use on the ground floor that we did need to have some steel to kind of account for those larger spaces. So that we had to account for that. And just wanted to take a moment to pause here to kind of ask you all, which project do you think will have the lowest whole life carbon? And we'll come back to this at the end of the project or at the end of the presentation. Argyle Gardens, it's 72 units. Solar has like the small SRO units. Hearth, 163 units. Retail, parking, wood over the concrete podium. 3,000 Powell, which is 196 units. It's using the new energy code. Or the Aurora, 93 units, all electric building with solar. So make a note of your guess and we'll come back to that later. So I just wanted to go into the operational carbon portion of it and start off with the process that we used. For the buildings that were occupied for at least a year and we had energy data on, we requested electricity and natural gas energy data for those. The Idaho projects, unfortunately, as we got into the nitty gritty of the project, we realized that Idaho has a law on the books that require a tenant release to release their energy data. And it just with the time frame that we had, it wasn't feasible to get 100+ occupants to all sign those. So for those projects and for a couple of the projects that were still under construction, we did create energy models using Revit Insight, which uses the DOE 2.2 simulation engine. One limitation of that is it's really good at it being able to get pretty precise with the envelope and get like accurate R values with your walls and floors. It is limited on the number of HVAC types that you can kind of input into the system. So for some of the projects that we did we had pretty close proxies, and then others that we kind of had to get sort of the best we could do with that. Once we had that, we converted that operational energy into operational carbon. So by multiplying the operational energy by energy source carbon intensity, so that comes from, if it's natural gas, that's pretty straightforward equation, and then the energy for electricity kind of depends on where your power is coming from, whether you're getting it from wind power or coal or nuclear. And then we used average in the Pacific Northwest for that. So this next graph is just looking at all the projects based off the energy use intensity, which is the overall energy consumption in terms of kBTU divided by the building area. The brownish orangish color is a baseline calculated using the Architecture 2030 Zero tool. The green is our EUI actual. based on 2022 utility bill data, takes into account reductions from solar power. And then the gray is our energy model based on Revit Insight. So there's a few projects where we, just to kind of compare the energy model to our actual, we did on 72 Foster and Nick Fish, we got both the actual data and our energy model data. And in both those cases, they were close, but actually the actual energy was lower than the energy model. So we felt pretty confident with the other projects that we didn't have actual data for, that the energy model would be either representational or the actual situation could be even a little bit better. This next graph is talking about the 2030 EUI target example. So 48 for the baseline. Then for those who don't know the Architecture 2030 Challenge, it's establishes a baseline, and then every so few years, the challenge is to try to drop that down lower and lower. So the 2020 baseline was goal is 80% reduction from that baseline at 9.6, and the 2025 coming up here in a year is 4.8. So it's going over the EUI comparison, site EUI, multifamily, and mixed use, and showing the average or the median of projects between 2015 and 2022. And just one note is to remember housing EUI is really closely linked to density. Each unit has hot water use, cooking, and plug loads. So it's a little, the more dense you get, the kind of higher EUI you have, which is can be a little bit counterintuitive sometimes. And then this graph is kind of looking at the operational comparisons per square meter of the different projects, ranging. We've got measured ranges from actual energy from 31.5 to 46.6 kilograms of CO2 per year per meter. The energy models have a little bit larger range between 26.6 and 55.2, and the median of all of those is 40.1 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per year per meter squared. That 40.1 kilograms of CO2, just to kind of make it into a more easier understandable number, is about the equivalent of 103 miles driven by an average car in the US. Then operational carbon comparisons of housing efficiency. This is another, what we thought, more useful way to look at the breakdown between the projects using energy use per unit in green, energy use per bedroom in gray, and energy use per occupant in blue. It doesn't reflect the additional advantages of the mixed uses in 72 Foster, Nick Fish, Hearth, and Fowler, who all have retail and offices in them. And then on a per unit, our low was 1,200-ish. The average was about 2,900, and the high was 4,400. When you go down to the per occupant, it drops down quite a bit to 865 for the low, 1,500 for the average, and 2,600 for the high. Some notes about these, you'll see like the Argyle Gardens doesn't have a whole lot of difference between the unit to occupant. That's because of the it all having either studios or the single room occupants. So it's basically a 1-for-1 unit to resident. Some of the bigger leaps between green and blue are projects that have a higher percentage of 3-bedroom units. So the unit will be fairly high, but we're assuming there's quite a few more people in there. And then just another breakdown of that mean between the different factors of unit, bedroom, occupant. Roughly that average for a unit is about the equivalent of driving 2/3 of a US car per year. At the bedroom size, that's about half of a car per year. And at the occupant level, it's closer to 1/3 of a car. And I'll hand it back over to Hannah for embodied carbon.
Great, thank you. Oops. Okay, so starting with some of the methodology for our embodied carbon portion of the study, we looked at the life cycle stages of the materials as shown on the screen. So the darker green, letters and numbers, the product stage A1, A2, A3, and A4, the use stages B2 through B5, and the end of life stages C2 through C4 with module D as well, which is potential benefits from recovering, reuse, and recycling. So we did exclude the lightened categories there, and that is because A, our software does not have that data in it to include, and B, that data is just really not agreed upon, and there isn't a lot of backup for that data. Another important note that is has a big impact on embodied carbon when we're looking at buildings with wood frame construction is biogenic carbon. So the assumption that our software makes is that at the end of life, about 32% of that biogenic carbon is indefinitely stored in a landfill. And so that is the net, basically, carbon storage that we get to take credit for. We used a software called Tally for our embodied carbon assessment, and this is a plugin for Revit, which most architects use in their just day-to-day practice to, do their construction documents. And we find that this software is really the most intuitive and fastest for our process and workflow. And we are trying to incorporate this on more projects in the future. So on the screen is just a snapshot of what that process looks like. So we get to take a material such as brick and make assumptions about the type of mortar, the grout width, and will it be replaced or is it expected to last the lifetime of the building? And basically what Tally does is it will count the quantity of the material as modeled in your 3D model, and it will tie that to data about the greenhouse gas impacts from producing and eventually disposing of that material. And it takes the embodied carbon of each material, adds it all together for the embodied carbon of your building. So we looked at 2 different scopes in terms of which materials we would include. We first had a base scope, and this included the roof, the framing, the enclosure, walls, and structure. We also looked at a full scope where we included a few additional categories of stairs, railings, doors, and ceilings. And we did this because it can take a long time to define all the materials in Tally. And if we can understand about what percentage of the total impacts are from these extra categories of doors and ceilings, maybe we can just use an estimate for that, at least at the early stages of our project. And we did exclude certain areas of scope from our study, and this is because there's really just not enough available data on these categories yet. And that would be MEP systems, fire sprinklers and alarms, casework, site work, elevators, and furnishings and fixtures. So I do want to pause and just take a moment to speak to the limitations of embodied carbon assessment. And people are obviously working on a lot of these issues right now, but they're still in process. So embodied carbon data for building systems is almost non-existent. There's a lack of data from specific material manufacturers. There's other impacts beyond embodied carbon, like habitat impacts, social impacts from where these materials are coming from. And one thing we've really seen in our embodied carbon assessments is that the results really should be treated as an estimate, and they're very closely linked to the software you use, your modeling quality, and your end-of-life assumptions. So it's really difficult right now to compare across different modelers, and you really want to have the same assumptions if you are going to compare projects. So looking at some of our first results, this is the comparison of the base scope versus that full scope of embodied carbon, which included the ceilings and stairs and doors. And on the left is that base scope, and then the right bar in the darker color is that full scope. So we saw about a 5% difference between that base and full. So those additional categories were contributing about 5% to the embodied carbon. And just one thing to note is these embodied carbon values are on this chart presented in kilograms CO2 per square meter. And that is, even in America, that is really the commonly used unit, even though it is, a metric unit. So we did that at least to tie in better to the benchmarks and the results from other people doing these studies. And looking at, the different projects, we saw the Nick Fish had the highest embodied carbon, which was, had a significant concrete podium. And, the lower embodied carbon was in the Aurora and Clara, which were pretty much all wood frame projects. We also wanted to look at what the results would be if we included and excluded biogenic carbon. And we do feel that it is appropriate to include biogenic carbon if the wood is coming from forests that are generally increasing in their stock. And this is kind of the international standard. Obviously, there's a lot more that you can get into with the forestry practices and knowing exactly where your wood is coming from. But across these projects, as we would expect, there was a higher total embodied carbon when the biogenic carbon was excluded. So when we have the wood frame projects, if we can't take credit for any carbon storage in the wood, that will show a higher total embodied carbon. And so between the projects at each one, the bar on the left is including biogenic carbon, the one on the right is excluding biogenic carbon. And the biggest difference we saw between the two was Argyle Gardens, which had the single resident occupancy units and had, more internal walls associated with that. We also looked at the breakdown per life cycle stage. So stage A is when the material is being produced. Stage B, which is the gray, is maintenance and replacements. The yellow stage is C, which is end of life. And green is benefits beyond a system boundary. So we can see the blue stage is the largest on the first 4 projects, which are all those concrete podium projects. But on the 4 projects to the right, which don't have the podium, end of life is the highest category. And so, especially when you don't have the concrete podium with those wood frame buildings, you're basically shifting that embodied carbon towards the end of life stage. And if that wood is recycled or, the carbon storage continues after a building is someday torn down, you could have a better carbon story. So we looked at this a lot of different ways. We also looked at it by material type. So breaking down with the different CSI divisions, Division 7, which is basically your enclosure, Division 6, which is wood, and so on and so forth. So this chart shows the breakdown between the different materials and how much they contribute to the embodied carbon. You see the dark gray is concrete, the The reddish orange is masonry. The yellow is wood. The purple is finishes such as paint and wallboard. The green is thermal and moisture protection. The blue is openings and glazing. And there's a light gray that is metal. So obviously we can see the big impact of the concrete podium. That's over half of the embodied carbon on those buildings. So huge, huge impact. One other interesting thing we see is the last one, number 8 and number 5, Argyle Gardens. They both have a large percentage in the green category, which is the enclosure category. And these projects are 2- and 3-story buildings. So basically they've got a greater surface area ratio to internal space. So depending on what typology and how tall your building is, you know, that could guide where you're focusing your energy on saving embodied carbon. So we also broke this down in terms of housing efficiency. Similar to the operational carbon, we wanted to look at the embodied carbon broken down to per unit, per bedroom, and per occupant. And so again, where we have you know, multiple bedroom units, we see a drop when we go, you know, per unit to per bedroom and to per occupant. And on this chart, we probably would be able to compare the first 4 projects and the second group of 4 projects differently, because the first 4 projects have that concrete podium, and this breakdown does not take into account the uses that are in that concrete podium, right? So they have a benefit. And we, again, just tried to put it in perspective of the average embodied carbon per unit, per bedroom, and per occupant. How many miles was that equivalent to in a gas-powered car? So this is where it starts to get interesting, where we're looking at, okay, embodied versus operational carbon. What does that look like over the lifespan of a building? So this is an example of a chart that we will look at on the following pages. The yellow is basically showing the emissions from natural gas as that accumulates over time. The green is the emissions from electricity. And at 2040, the Oregon grid is legislated to reach 0 carbon emissions. So, you know, this is really optimistic and hopeful, and we don't necessarily know if the rest of the you know, Western power pool is going to have these same targets. But for the case of the study, we are showing, you know, the emissions flattening off to 0 at that 2040 point. We are also showing that gray line, dark charcoal gray line, is showing the embodied carbon over time. And the blue line is where we are just adding a 30% MEP estimate to help account for some of the embodied carbon categories that we were not able to include in our software. And so you can see the embodied carbon jumps at certain points to represent the embodied carbon from repair and replacement, and finally jumps again at end of life when materials are sent to a landfill or recycled. And so a key point is, you know, where that where the yellow and green shaded region overtakes the embodied carbon. So that's basically that crossover point when your cumulative emissions from your operational carbon are, you know, surpassing the embodied carbon. So I'll go through these pretty quickly, but these are the embodied versus operational charts for each of the projects. One thing to note is that they are all on the same scale. So, you know, the graphs have the same starting point and end point, so you can, you know, compare them side by side. And, you know, these are some of the concrete podium projects, and you can really see how, you know, the natural gas continues to increase, you know, accumulate over time versus there's a point where, you know, hopefully we are reaching close to, you know, net zero decarbonized electricity grid. And one thing to note is that this is just a projection, and these projects could improve their carbon emissions by basically switching out any gas systems to electric systems. These are also concrete podium buildings, and at the end of life, one thing to note is that the embodied carbon would be about 30% to 35% of the total whole life carbon of the building. So and these are a little bit older projects, I think 2018, 2019. So we're really seeing how embodied carbon is starting to, be a really high percentage of the impacts of our project as our operational carbon is decreasing with more efficient systems. These are Argyle Gardens in 3000 Powell, so fairly similar charts. And again, this is, the whole life carbon per square meter. And because of how dense, because when you get more dense projects, there's just more energy being used, per square meter. So you're kind of seeing that with Argyle Gardens versus 3000 Powell. So finally, we are seeing the Aurora and the Clara, and the Aurora was the only all-electric project in our study. And so you can see it really has the lowest whole life carbon, but with our all-electric projects, embodied carbon is really projected to make up a larger percentage of the total carbon, over the lifespan of a project. So looking at just the whole life carbon per square meter, each bar, the darker portion, is the operational carbon. The lighter portion is the embodied carbon. So if you guessed the Aurora would have the lowest whole life carbon, you were correct. Pat yourself on the back. And you can see that that is really an outlier if we decarbonize the grid. And this is looking at the whole life carbon, both embodied and operational per unit, per bedroom, and per occupant. So, again, you can see the Aurora is still doing really well, as well as Argyle Gardens, which maybe had a higher whole life carbon per meter squared, but a lower whole life carbon, per unit, per bedroom. So I'd just like to share a few of the key takeaways and lessons that we found in this project. And one is just that operational energy usage reporting really needs to be set up and planned before a project is complete. Energy Star Portfolio Manager is a really great tool, and if the Idaho projects were using that software, I think we would have been able to get that energy usage data. And, if you can set up a way to share your data back with architects and engineers, that's a really important feedback loop, so they know if there are problems with the building or, how well things are going. Obviously, we don't like to know that there are problems, but it is really important so that we can build better buildings. And it's also really great for building owners to be reviewing this data. A lot of our building owners they didn't really know what the energy usage of their building was. And so, if you can monitor that over time, you can pinpoint problems or just ways that you can save on energy usage. We found that some of the best performing projects in terms of being most efficient in operational embodied carbon were Argyle Gardens, which had, the lowest present day operational and embodied carbon per unit and per bedroom. Over time, the Aurora had the lowest whole life carbon per bedroom and per occupant. This is looking at just the present day operational CO2 and embodied CO2. So again, operational and embodied, Argyle Gardens had the lowest per unit per bedroom. For operational carbon, 3000 Powell had the lowest operational carbon per occupant, and in embodied carbon, the Claire had the lowest embodied carbon per occupant. And then when we go to whole life carbon, which takes into account over time as the grid electrifies, the Aurora was the lowest per bedroom and per occupant. So we really saw how the units with multiple bedrooms provided efficiencies in both embodied and operational carbon per occupant. And, you know, this is pretty intuitive, but if there are fewer kitchens, living spaces, and bathrooms to build, heat, and cool, that is going to, on a per occupant basis, provide, you know, a lower whole life carbon emissions. We found, again, that the concrete podium buildings, the concrete made up the highest percentage of embodied carbon. So, you know, there is a really great benefit to densification and mixed use, which is something that you pretty much need a concrete podium for. But there is a lot of potential in the future as, you know, the building code adapts to mass timber, and how can we maybe in the future have a mass timber podium building? And so if you do have, you know, if you have any concrete in your building, low carbon concrete is a really great one priority to reduce the embodied carbon of your structure, and just to consider ways to reduce concrete quantity, especially for something like parking, which it can, if it's structured parking, can take a lot of concrete. We found that our wood frame buildings without the podium had a higher end of life embodied carbon than the concrete podium buildings. And this is partially due to how the biogenic carbon is accounted for. On day one, it reduces the initial embodied carbon. However, at the end of life, we have to assume that some of that biogenic carbon is released at the end of life. So that's a little bit of why you're seeing that. Again, we found that the Aurora would have the lowest whole life carbon, which is great. And again, this is a simplification, and there probably still will be, there still will be some emissions from electricity past that 2040 point, but it's a very hopeful projection. And you know, it's possible that the other projects could easily electrify as well. We found that most of the other projects just had a gas water heater, so that's just one system that could be swapped out to electrify the buildings. And so that's a really great place to focus efforts on. We found that the concrete podium buildings had the highest whole life carbon per unit per bedroom and per occupant, but not always per square meter. And you know, this ties back into the density piece and the parking piece. You know, with the parking, that's usually unconditioned space, so it kind of skews that per square meter value. One thing that surprised us is that the whole life carbon for 6 of the buildings had a pretty, what I would consider a pretty tight range of 1,100 kilograms CO2 per square meter to 1,540 kilograms CO2 per square meter. So despite the differences in use, size, and building systems, you know, it wasn't as varied as we might expect. And again, the Aurora was the outlier here. So just a few final thoughts. Number one, it's really important to set your goals for EUI, operational carbon, and embodied carbon early in a project. And this gives something to track progress against. And, you know, when you get into those value engineering discussions, to make sure everyone's aligned on the key goals of a project. Again, we think it's really important to track the aggregate energy usage and set up feedback loops with architects, engineers, owners, and stakeholders. One evolving embodied carbon issue is just requesting that data from MEP manufacturers. So requesting it from your MEP consultants, to try to request it from those manufacturers. They might not have it, but the more requests they get, the more likely they are to think about providing that. And finally, these are all new construction, but we do think that, the most sustainable building is really the one that is already built. So how can we take existing buildings and extend their lifespan, make them resilient and make them energy efficient for the future? It's just a really important consideration. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions for Ben or I. We did not, but that is a really good, that would be a really good study in comparison. And I guess one thing to note about these buildings is they were, energy efficient, systems efficient to code, and some of them above code, like 3000 PAL and the Aurora. I think the Aurora was Earth Advantage, but we're still not necessarily meeting those 2030 goals for EUI. So. Yeah, actually, I feel like I see Dave in the room. I wonder if he has any good insight because he's worked on a lot of more projects than I have.
For sure, affordable housing developers care more about life cycle than most market rate developers. But I think the tension point we're seeing lately is the first cost versus the long-term cost and the very constrained funding cycles we have. And so, we're put in this very tough situation of making choices about something that's going to last a long time, something that has the long view in mind versus making sure we get a project built and people housed as soon as possible. So that tension is something that we're always navigating, as I'm sure a lot of folks in this room are as well. But I think that's also part of like who we tend to do a lot of repeat work with is folks with shared values about thinking about the long term. And that's where when you get everybody on the same page, you can make some wise decisions and try to get the most bang for your buck. So I don't know if that answered your question, but. Yeah, and predicting when the building gets demolished also is kind of a crystal ball thing that is even above and beyond what we can predict, with the stuff we can control. So.
And I just want to add quick that, Portland, at least Portland, Oregon, has a pretty good, set of requirements for demolition of existing buildings and the recycling of the materials and what you do with the construction waste. So that is at least one positive aspect that, is beneficial in the embodied carbon aspect. Yeah, that's a great question. We are working on that one basically right now. So I believe KPFF did embodied carbon assessment of that, of just the structures. So we're working on the embodied carbon assessment, including all the drywall that we need to achieve the fire ratings in that building type. So it'll be really interesting to see, with those two layers of drywall over a lot, how does that play into the overall impacts of the mass timber benefits. Yeah, so that was interior finishes. So that would be carpet or any floor finishes, luxury vinyl tile, whatnot, as well as the drywall and repainting. So this is also somewhere where you need to make a certain assumption about how often those will be replaced. And we basically assume a pretty generous, like 7 years for basically repainting everything, but we're just a blanket assumption. Obviously, there will be some drywall patch and repair, but for the most part, holding that same drywall finish for that life of the building. Yeah, so we did not, just in terms of like time and simplification, and it's really tricky because we, the carbon emissions grid intensity that we used was for the Western Power Pool, which is a huge region of the Pacific Northwest where basically power is shared across state lines, depending on what the needs are and where power is being produced. And that's really just the EPA's guideline. Like if you're going to calculate your carbon emissions for your electricity use, this is the number that you use. And other electricity providers do have targets usually to decrease their carbon emissions from their grid, but they are all over the place. So we definitely chose the simplified version.
I'll just add the funding was from ETO, Energy Trust of Oregon, so they were particularly interested in Oregon projects. So that's another factor in why we decided to just look at power from Oregon.
Actually, could you just expand just a little more on that? I want to give a good answer. Yeah, oof, that's a really kind of loaded question, I think. Uh, but I think at least at Holst, we are really striving to create good design within our modern context and the context of Portland. And so I think, you would look at probably a lot of our designs and say this is more modern as opposed to maybe more traditional. But I don't think that necessarily means that it won't be preserved or valued in the future. But I do think that is, a good consideration in terms of especially high quality materials like brick, and trying to bring some of those traditional elements into more of a modern design and really thinking through all the details in ways that you know are cohesive with the design.
I think maybe one thing you're getting at a little bit might be natural ventilation and natural lighting, which we've kind of gotten away from with electrical lighting and HVAC, and it's certainly something that we look at in our projects and account for. Unfortunately, it's not a great thing, or it's not very easy to account for with the software we were using. It doesn't necessarily assume that someone's not going to turn on a light because the room is lit well because of the window. So it's kind of hard to quantify in that way, but we do in all the projects try to account for those things.
And I just think, one more point is, a lot of the more traditional details to do them really well, it's actually can be really costly. And there's a lot that's of our type, typologies of, 5/1 that is, really just driven by pro formas and cost. And there's also, I think we always have to fight for keeping quality materials on projects as we go through value engineering. So that's just another aspect that unfortunately plays into it.
Yeah, that's so the Oregon building department's currently going through revision of the building code, I think for 2025, and they're currently looking at some kind of standard for embodied carbon. I don't think they've landed on whether it's going to be more of a carrot or a stick approach, but I think that's coming out sort of the end of the year that they'll be presenting it to the legislature, as far as I know.
Yeah, so that was part of that, the excluded categories of MEP systems. And, that is another like really tricky, tricky topic of, where are those materials coming from? There's not just great large scale recycling for PV panels yet. That's, cost effective. So just kind of another challenge. Any other questions? It sounds like they might be working on that embodied carbon piece, which would be, I think that would be a huge push to help, to make buildings more sustainable. If you don't force people to do it through code, you're going to have fewer people doing it. And that's just the reality of we see that our buildings are becoming more efficient and more sustainable through through code updates and things that are basically forcing us to build better buildings.
I'll add to electrifying buildings, as we saw with the Aurora. Assuming the grid does decarbonize, natural gas is never going to decarbonize, no matter what some people might say. So, if we can transition away from that and with our buildings, I think California has been a leader in that and starting to require some heat pump technology and projects. So another lever for them to push.
Yeah, and if you don't have to run the gas line to your building, you're at least you're saving that too, which is kind of offsetting a little bit the electrification. Woohoo! Any final questions? All right. Well, I think we can wrap up then.